from the world of politics.
The gun decisions reinforce, particularly in European eyes, a sense that the United States is culturally and politically a very different country than they thought it was.
To the world of business.
When it comes to recession, of course, it matters so much for the real economy. And frankly, when real wage growth is declining, as it already is, this environment, no matter what the technical data says, probably feels like recession for a lot of households anyway.
This is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. We start today up on Capitol Hill at the Supreme Court of the United States once again, because history is about to be made. In a few moments, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson is going to become Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. She will be the first black woman to serve on the Supreme Court as a justice. She'll be sworn in first by the Chief Justice with a constitutional oath, and then with a judicial oath administered by her old boss, Justice Breyer, whom she is replacing. We're going to try to bring you that live, although we are relying on the Supreme Court feed of a stream, so we'll see whether that works or not. In the meantime, we turn to our Washington correspondent, Emily Wilkins, who is up there just near the court. So, Emily, put this day in perspective, the history being made.
I mean, it is a historic day because for the first time, the highest court in the land will have a black female judge serving on it. And also for the first time today, the Supreme Court, a majority of justices serving on it will not be white men. So certainly diversity can be seen on both sides, from the more liberal justices and the more conservative justices at this point. I think it really speaks to the fact that both parties have really realized the fact that they need to make sure that they need to be diverse, that diversity is important in terms of sex, in terms of race. And I think sort of today is a hallmark of a number of decades and a number of efforts by lawmakers, by presidents of both parties, to really get the diversity in there. And
it is happening today because it is the last day of the term, because they brought down their last decisions, and we were told that Justice Breyer would not step down until the last day of the term. That happens today, right about now. So, Emily, take us through those last two decisions. First of all, the one that may matter the most to people who watch Bloomberg regularly, and that's the EPA decision, an important regulatory decision when it comes to climate, and perhaps more.
Yeah, this absolutely curtails, first of all, exactly what the Biden administration is going to be able to do in enacting its climate goals through the EPA. Now, the justices didn't say that the EPA couldn't regulate any sort of emissions, but that did put some limits on exactly how far the EPA could go. And David, this could wind up having impacts not just in the EPA, but really across regulatory agencies, which numerous presidents, Biden, Trump, Obama, even before that, have really used to try to push forward their initiatives when Congress has stalled. And what we saw the court say today is that this can't really be the case going forward. If legislation needs to come, if we need new laws, if we need significant changes, that will need to come from Congress, not from various federal agencies, as presidents have used in the past. And certainly this does have wider climate impacts, really puts more pressure on Democrats right now. They're still talking about potentially moving this broad legislation that could include some climate goals. The pressure is now on senators, including Senator Joe Manchin, to try and find a path forward to get some of that done now that Biden and the EPA can't do as much as they initially thought they would be able to.
Emily, as you quite correctly point out, the Supreme Court did not say that the EPA can never do it. They just said you can't do it unless Congress amends the Clean Air Act to give you explicit permission. But you cover Capitol Hill so much. How realistic is it to expect Congress to go back and change this law now if the effects would be to say you no longer can use coal or even perhaps natural gas, you have to go over to renewables?
That would be pretty hard to do. I mean, right now, the climate changes that we're seeing, it's being done through this Reconciliation Act, but you can't just do anything through reconciliation. You can only do certain things that have a budgetary impact. And in thinking about how Congress moves, I mean, I think back to 2013, Congress struck down a key part of an Equal Voting Rights Act, said, hey, Congress, if you want to do this, this is great, but you're going to need to pass legislation. More than, almost a decade on now, we still haven't seen any sort of that legislation be able to pass Congress. It just shows really now how gridlocked things are and how difficult it is for them to move legislation.
And Emily, we are awaiting the swearing in of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson as a justice of the Supreme Court. We believe that may happen imminently. We're seeing some video right now from one of the conference rooms up there at the court. Emily, one more decision came down today. Interestingly, both decisions came from the Chief Justice, but this one went the other way. It was the question of the so-called Remain in Mexico rule.
Yes, this one basically the court sided with President Biden. They said that the Homeland Security and the folks at the border, they don't need to have immigrants and migrants wait in Mexico to be determined whether or not they can come in and in what capacity.
Emily, thank you so very much. I think we're going to go to the Supreme Court of the United States right now. Chief Justice Roberts is speaking, introducing the new Justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson.
But before we do so, I would like to recognize Dr. Patrick Jackson, who is here, her husband, and her daughters Talia and Layla. The administration of the oath is required both by the Constitution and by the Judiciary Act, and so we'll be delivering two oaths. I'll deliver the constitutional oath, and Justice Breyer will administer the statutory oath. There will be a formal investiture in the fall, but the oaths will allow Judge Jackson to undertake her duties, and she's been anxious to get to them without any further delay. Are you prepared to take the oath?
I am.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Ketanji Brown Jackson, do solemnly swear.
I, Ketanji Brown Jackson, do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same.
That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same.
That I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion.
That I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion.
And that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I'm about to enter.
And that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you very much. And now I'll turn things over to Justice Breyer.
Good. The judicial oath. Will you raise your right hand, please? Thank you. I, Ketanji Brown Jackson.
I, Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Do solemnly swear.
Do solemnly swear.
That I will administer justice.
That I will administer justice.
Without respect to persons.
Without respect to persons.
And do equal right.
And do equal right.
To the poor and to the rich.
To the poor and to the rich.
And that I will faithfully and impartially.
And that I will faithfully and impartially.
Discharge and perform.
Discharge and perform.
All the duties.
All the duties.
Incumbent upon me.
Incumbent upon me.
As an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States.
As an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States.
Under the Constitution.
Under the Constitution.
And laws of the United States.
And laws of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Now, on behalf of all of the members of the court, I am pleased to welcome Justice Jackson to the court and to our common calling.
And there you have it, a moment of history being made in the Supreme Court. I believe that's the West Conference rooms. There are two conferences up there. It looks like the West one, first with an oath administered under the requirements of the Constitution by the Chief Justice of the United States, and then by Justice, now Ketanji Brown Jackson's former boss, Stephen Breyer, who is just effectively retiring. And they recess now outside of the conference room. So that was a moment of history, the first black woman to serve as a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. I want to pick up now on one of the important decisions that came down today. That was the EPA decision in which the court really said that the EPA did not have the authority to go as far as it did under the Clean Air Act. We welcome back Blake Emerson. He's professor at the UCLA School of Law. So welcome back. Yesterday we were talking about what might happen here. Let me start with the most basic question. We talked about going narrow, going broad. Which way did the court go?
Thanks so much, David. First of all, just a quick congratulations to Justice Jackson. So the ruling opted for a narrower version. So instead of saying that the EPA that Congress could not give EPA authority under the Constitution to make this big decision about regulating the power grid, instead the court said that the Clean Air Act itself did not give the EPA that broad authority. So it was the narrower of those two possibilities. But one thing I want to point out is that it's not even clear that the court should have taken this case in the first place. And the Constitution provides that the court is only supposed to decide cases and controversies. That means there has to be something really concrete in dispute, some kind of a real injury somebody suffered because of the way the government or somebody else in society acted. And that was arguably absent in this case. And I and a lot of other commentators would say that the court here has issued an advisory opinion in the absence of anything really at stake. And that's because the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan never went into effect. The Supreme Court itself stayed it, and the dates, the deadlines set in that plan have passed. So the plan itself cannot go back into effect. Nonetheless, the court wanted to make a statement that EPA and other federal regulatory agencies cannot decide matters of vast economic and political significance without explicit congressional authority.
It's an important point because the first part of the majority opinion is given over to that question of justiciability, as they call it in the legal profession. But the majority decided it was justiciable after all. But let's talk about exactly what the next steps are to be taken here. For example, if you're the EPA administrator right now, what do you do in the wake of this decision? Is there anything left for you to do, or do you just have to say, I have to wait for Congress?
Oh, for sure the EPA can still act, and the EPA is currently in the process of working on regulations with regard to climate change. What it certainly does on the narrowest level is it will tell the EPA you cannot make grid level regulations and guidelines of the sort that the Obama administration tried to do in the Clean Power Plan. That means requiring states to submit plans that will shift the mix of power from fossil fuels to renewables. So those kinds of regulations appear to be out now. That doesn't mean that the EPA could not still make plant-specific regulations. You know, things like making it more efficient the way in which you burn coal or other kinds of fossil fuels or other kinds of technologies at the plant. So,
Professor, that's exactly what I wanted to ask about, because as I look through the opinion quickly, and you understand this much better than I do, it sounded like you can tell a company that is using coal to generate electricity, you got to be more efficient the way you do it. You can't tell them to say you can't burn coal, you got to go to renewables.
That's right. So you can tell an existing plant owner, look, you got to find a better way to burn the coal that's not going to be as polluting, and here are some ways to do it. Experts in environmental technologies seem to think that those sort of heat rate improvements are not very effective, in part because, you know, if you make it more efficient to burn coal, maybe people will just end up burning more coal, right? I mean, so it's kind of the supply and demand logic going on there. So it's not clear how effective those techniques will be, but there are other techniques such as carbon capture that are being developed that are at the plant level that this opinion wouldn't touch, but are also could be very burdensome and expensive. And this was one of the issues that Justice Kagan raised in her opinion, that, you know, it's not clear that plant-specific regulations are going to be less burdensome and raise more minor questions than regulations outside the fence. But the court says outside the fence regulations are out, inside the fence regulations for now are still in.
Professor, let me ask the broader question here that you and I discussed a bit yesterday, because there was a third opinion, which was Justice Gorsuch, where he said, I'm going along with what they say, but there are really constitutional underpinnings of this major question doctrine. And the question is, what could this mean for the next case coming up that's outside the EPA? When it's the SEC, it's another sort of agency. Is this indicating perhaps, and is Justice Gorsuch pointing in the direction, there may be more coming?
Yes. So first of all, I think Justice Gorsuch is in fact correct that there's a constitutional logic underlying the major questions doctrine, and that's the non-delegation doctrine. The idea here is that Congress cannot delegate its legislative power to the executive branch. Now, that constitutional doctrine is suspect, and people thought it was long dead up until a few years ago, when Justice Gorsuch and other members of the court appeared to want to revive it. And so Justice Gorsuch's concurrence again underscores that this non-delegation doctrine is back, and there might be a future case in which the court actually relies on it to say a statute passed by Congress, not just a regulation as in this case, but a statute passed by Congress, is unconstitutional because it gives too much authority to the executive branch. Now, even leaving that aside, the major questions ruling in the majority opinion, in which Gorsuch and Alito concurred, also is going to have major impacts potentially on other agencies. I mean, there are tons of regulations that are in process that might have major implications. You know, SEC regulations about climate-related disclosures. We have regulations coming out about the sale of guns, right? So we have ghost guns that can't be easily traced. And because the major questions doctrine is so broad, because it, you know, as Justice Roberts said in this case, the major questions doctrine comes up whenever it makes a judge raise an eyebrow. So if you look at all these regulations, a judge either at the Supreme Court or in an appellate court or even in a district court might raise their eyebrow at, say, the ATF's ability to regulate firearms and decide that it's out simply because it seems like it's too broad an exercise of authority. And to my mind, that's pretty dangerous.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's really helpful analysis from you. Thank you, Professor. That's Professor Blake Emerson of the UCLA Law School. Coming up, Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania is here to talk about inflation, the Fed, and how it could do better. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We have a lot going on in Washington right now, and some of it involves the Supreme Court, as we just heard about. We're going to start on that subject with Republican Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. He serves on the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. Senator, great to have you back here.
Thanks.
We've got a lot to talk about in the banking sector, but let's pick up, first of all, on that EPA decision and the major questions doctrine and what it may indicate, not just about the EPA, but about other agencies that you're familiar with in Washington, and how far they can go with that explicit congressional authorization.
Yeah, so I think there's a very concerted effort by some on the left to try to achieve through the unelected and therefore unaccountable branches of government what they can't achieve through legislation. So whether it's the courts or it's regulators, we've seen this effort to affect policy. I see it in the Banking Committee, for instance, with the SEC. SEC attempting to impose this whole climate change disclosure regime that is completely divorced from financially material information that has historically been the guide for what has to be disclosed, and with no authority from Congress to do that. There was a major effort to have the Federal Reserve actually allocate capital away from the fossil fuel industry in order to accelerate a transition to a low-carbon economy. So I've been fighting this fight for quite some time because my argument is it shouldn't be about how quickly you think we ought to transition our economy. It's about who decides and who's accountable. In a democratic society, it has to be the people who are held accountable by the American people.
So, Senator, you know very well what the response is to that. You've heard it, I'm sure, which is the following. There are a lot of things going on in this country. It's a very complicated country with a lot of important issues. Even in the opinions that we saw today, we had the majority admit that climate is a really tough issue. Congress has not shown its propensity to get a lot done very quickly. So effectively, that's saying we're not going to do anything about it. That's what the other side would say to what you just said.
Yeah, well, they might say that. They would be ignoring what we did during 2020 and 2021 when we passed several $1 trillion worth of spending and new programs in direct response to the emergency of the moment, which was the lockdowns resulting from the pandemic. And they're really, that message, that idea is to basically another way of saying, you know, democracy doesn't really work. And so what we need to have is an omnipotent group of bureaucrats, and they'll be really smart, and they'll make all the decisions. That's not what America's about. And so, yeah, it's messy. You may not get the outcomes you prefer. You might have to wait longer than you'd like. But in the end, it's a democratic process that assures that the American people are actually sovereign. I think this idea that Congress isn't very effective, so let's just have a super legislative body, it's very offensive and deeply undemocratic.
So you mentioned before the Federal Reserve, something you've been very involved in. Obviously, we have an inflation problem. I think everybody can agree on that right now.
Yeah, I hope so.
And we heard actually from the U.S. central banker, the Fed Chair Jay Powell, yesterday, appearing over in Europe, about what they're going to do about inflation. This is part of what he had to say.
Strongly committed to using our tools to get inflation to come down. The way to do that is to slow down growth, ideally keep it positive, and as I mentioned, supply and demand get back into balance. So that's what we're trying to accomplish. Is there a risk that we would go too far? Certainly there's a risk. But I wouldn't agree that it's the biggest risk to the economy. I think that, the bigger mistake to make, let's put it that way, would be to fail to restore price stability.
So, Senator, do you agree with the chair? I mean, you've not just been a senator. You've spent time on Wall Street. You know sort of the way the markets work at this point. Is the bigger risk right now recession or inflation?
Well, I think inflation's the bigger risk because it's here. It's real. And if inflation doesn't come under control quickly, it does enormous long-term damage. Is there a risk that we have a recession? Yes, I think clearly there's a significant risk that within the next 12 months we'll have a recession. My quarrel with the Fed and how it has managed monetary policy, and the reason we've gotten in this dilemma, is because I think there's a mindset at the Fed that sees inflation as a psychological problem rather than a monetary problem. And by that I mean they are so focused on inflation expectations and not so much focused on the massive expansion in the money supply, the huge quantitative easing, the negative real interest rates, which persist to this day. Those things, I think, are what almost assured us that combined with massive overspending that was then financed by debt that was monetized by the Fed, this is a recipe for inflation. And I think the Fed gets it, that there's a problem. And they're going to move aggressively, I think, but I'm still not convinced that they view this in the optimal sort of framework.
There's a substantive set of issues here. Process also matters, and you've been outspoken about the process surrounding the Fed right now, the possible reform that you think is appropriate. It came out of actually Sarah Bloom Raskin's confirmation hearing, I recall. What would you do if you had your druthers about regulatory reform for the Fed and its operation?
Well, we're wrestling with that because we have the situation where the Fed is basically stonewalling Congress. The regional banks, and to some extent the main Fed, are taking the position that what we do is none of your business. We're an independent agency. You can't really look very closely on what we do. That's outrageous, right? The Fed exists as a creature of Congress, right? We delegate to the Fed the constitutional authority to control the supply of money that the Constitution gives to us. But in the case, for instance, of the Kansas City Fed, first turning down, then approving, then repealing, apparently, master accounts for Reserve Trust, a fintech company based in Colorado, we've simply said, hey, could explain to us the methodology here, and we're getting stonewalled. The answer is no, none of your business. They're taking the position that they're not accountable to anyone, and that's not acceptable. So there's a few things we could do. We could have more Fed officials subject to Senate confirmation.
Like the regional presidents, for example?
For instance, yes. We could do that. We could subject them to FOIA, which they're not subject to now. We could have a consolidation of the regional banks. You know, the regional banks are really an artifact of a time when the money supply was managed separately among the various regions. So there's a lot we could do. Bottom line is they've got to be more transparent and accountable.
But I know that you respect and really value the independence of the Fed. We need an independent central bank. Where does the line exist between transparency on the one hand and regulation on the other? You can easily lapse from one over into the other.
Well, sure. I mean, the independence that we generally focus on is the independence to set monetary policy, because we worry that political pressure will always be there to have ultra easy money and that is destructive over the long haul. And I get that, and I'm sympathetic to that argument. When we're talking about the issuance of a master account, that's a very valuable public good. It's the ability to conduct monetary transactions directly with the Fed. Every fintech in America would love to have it. Virtually none of them do. How the Fed goes about issuing those, that's something that Congress ought to have some say in. We ought to at least have some oversight on.
Finally, let me ask you one political question, if I may. You've been outspoken about what happened in January 6th. Putting aside what you're hearing in the hearings right now, do you think that this effectively means that Donald J. Trump won't get to run for a second term?
Oh, I don't know that it means that. I mean, he gets to decide whether he's going to run, whether or not he's successful. Look, I think he disqualified himself from serving in public office by virtue of his post-election behavior, especially leading right up to January 6th. I think the revelations from this committee make his path to even the Republican nomination much more tenuous. never say never, and he decides whether to throw his hat in the ring. But I think we'll have a stronger candidate.
Okay, Senator, thank you so much. Really appreciate you visiting us today. That's Senator Pat Toomey, Republican of Pennsylvania. And this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. We're going to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. For that, we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word. Mark?
David, thank you. An historic day at the U.S. Supreme Court. Ketanji Brown Jackson has been sworn in as the first black woman on the nation's highest court. The 51-year-old was confirmed to replace Stephen Breyer in April, but she then had to wait until he stepped down at the end of the court's term. Justice Jackson is likely to join fellow Democratic appointees Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan in the court's liberal wing. President Biden says he would support changing the Senate's filibuster rules to pass legislation ensuring access to abortion, calling the Supreme Court destabilizing for controversial decisions. The president was speaking to reporters on the final day of the NATO summit in Madrid.
We have to codify Roe v. Wade in the law, and the way to do that is to make sure the Congress votes to do that. And if the filibuster gets in the way, it's like voting rights. It should be, we provide an exception for this.
Mr. Biden has been under pressure from liberal Democrats to respond more aggressively to that Supreme Court decision. In Texas, 4 men have been arrested in connection with the deaths of 53 migrants smuggled into the United States from Mexico in a sweltering tractor trailer. All of the victims were believed to have been in the U.S. illegally, most of them coming from Mexico or Central America. 2 of the suspects were arrested on migrant smuggling charges, while the other 2 are being held on gun charges. China's Xi Jinping has made his first trip outside the mainland in almost 900 days. President Xi traveled to Hong Kong, calling the city reborn since he last visited 5 years ago. His comments were an apparent reference to the sweeping security law Beijing imposed in 2020 that crushed dissent. Xi is marking the 25th anniversary of Chinese rule in the former British colony. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. So the big question, of course, in the United States of America is inflation, what the Fed's going to do about it, and whether it will drive us into some sort of recession. We even went over to Sintra, Portugal, to hear from Fed Chair Jay Powell yesterday on that very subject. Now we welcome somebody who really knows the economy and reports on it every single day, at least into my inbox. He's Ed Hyman. He's Evercore ISI chairman and also Evercore vice chairman. So welcome, Ed. Great to have you here in the studio.
My pleasure.
Let me go back to what Jay Powell said yesterday. He said, we're going to do whatever it takes on inflation, even if we risk going into recession. Which is the bigger danger right now?
They're both dangers. But it seems to me that there's no doubt the Fed's going to keep pushing until they get some progress on inflation. I think we're going to have a financial shock somewhere. We always have one in a tightening cycle. And the economy is going to continue to weaken. And some mosaic of that will cause the Fed to change a little bit. Maybe they'll say no more 75s. Or they'll do a 50 and they'll do no more 50s, they'll do 25s. Or maybe they'll say, we'll skip the next meeting, we're still tightening. But they're going to keep pushing for sure. But I think there's a pretty good chance now, as the data comes out today, in addition to the past few months, that inflation has started to come down.
Well, that was my question. Are they making progress? Because I saw your note from today, and you noted that PCE is not as hot as the CPI was.
Right.
5-year is coming down some. Right. Are they making some progress, or is it too soon to tell?
It's probably too soon to tell. But, you know, my job is to try and go where the puck is going. And not that I'm a hockey player, but like your colleague. You mentioned inflation expectations. They're down about 100 basis points. Gasoline futures are down about 70 or 80 cents. And commodity prices today are down decisively. Like nat gas is down a lot. And so commodity prices have come down, including the food complex. And then we survey retailers about pricing power. We've been doing it systematically for over a decade, and that's dropped like 10 points in the past 3 weeks. And they have excess inventories, and so they're having to do some discounting. So if I may elaborate one more point.
Please.
Probably 6 months ago, I always collect anecdotal evidence, but I had two people in 2 days tell me that they were having to pay up to $25 to get a dishwasher, one in Minnesota and one in South Carolina. And I go, wow. Last night, I had a guy tell me who does light manufacturing in Florida. He'd gone from 14 to 15 to 16 to 17 to $18, and now he was getting workers back in. So I don't think wages are going to go down by any means, but I think we might be seeing some light at the end of the tunnel here on inflation.
Are we worried about consumer spending at all? I mean, is that what we want it to come off? Because the consumer spending numbers were down, for example, the numbers today, and that's sort of a trend right now.
Yeah. So you know this story, but I'll say it again. Income in today's numbers was up about 0.5% or 6% annual rate. And it's been running, it's probably up 11% year on year, nominal income. Now, it turns out that inflation is like 7% or 6%. And so the income is there, but it's all being eaten up in price. So the real that's left over is only like 1 or 2%. In this latest month, it was down slightly. But as long as the income is there, I think the spending is there. And if I could continue to be on your program or your wish list.
You're always welcome.
I've studied this so much. We've never, ever had a recession without an inverted yield curve. Yeah, I go back to 1929, not that I was there, but 1929, and then Japan in 1989, and 2007, the yield curve inverted, and we get a recession. And now the yield curve is, you got bond yields at 3 or something, and Fed funds at 2 or so. So you still got a pretty steep yield curve.
One of the things that's different this time is the pandemic. We've never had a pandemic like that, certainly in 100 years, and part of it is the supply shock. One of the reasons I really follow all your research so carefully is what you say about the supply chain. Yeah. And what are the data showing us? Are we starting to unravel the knots in the supply chain?
Some. Slow process probably. There's still, like this, auto inventories are still low. But I'm glad you brought that up because it's a point I really would like to make. We had the pandemic. We had big fiscal stimulus. We had QE, zero rates. And we had the fastest money growth in 8 decades, 30%. And when you get extremes like that, you're going to get inflation. And you happen at the same time to have bottlenecks. So it's a real bad cocktail.
Well, one of the things I saw in your June report was our money supply growth is slowing down, and Europe's is as well. China's going the other way.
Yeah. So China's really an outlier here. I'd like to continue to discuss with you. Money growth was almost 30% a year ago, fastest in 8 decades. Now it's down to about 6, and it's been flat probably for 3 months. I don't know when the last time that was. But as Milton Friedman pointed out, the Depression occurred because we had a contraction in money. So the Fed doesn't really report on money. Maybe they watch it, I don't know. But I'm concerned that if money goes negative, which it's starting to do with quantitative tightening, that we could have a much worse economy than I'm forecasting.
So your concern is we may be slowing down the money growth too much.
Oh, listen, we're already there.
Yeah.
I think it was unchanged in April, unchanged in May, and with the data we have on bank deposits, it's probably unchanged in June.
One more, Ed, and that's the strength of the dollar and exports, because the trade deficit has really been up there because we started importing again when we came out of the pandemic. We don't seem to be exporting as much. How big a threat is that?
Exports are okay. The trade numbers improved recently, but I'm watching the dollar really carefully. The dollar trades a lot on technicals. Mm-hmm. Because it's so hard to forecast. And it's about to make an upside breakout. It's like that close. Now, that also puts downward pressure on inflation. When the dollar goes up, it pushes down commodity prices, which may be one of the things that's pushing down commodity prices now.
Yeah. So you can see why Ed Hyman is the authority when it comes to reporting in the economy. Thank you so much to Ed Hyman. He's Evercore ISI chairman and Evercore vice chairman. Coming up, we go over what was decided in the NATO meetings over in Madrid with former NATO Deputy Secretary General Rose Gottemoeller. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. President Biden is on his way back, I believe, right now from Madrid, Spain, where he attended that meeting of NATO members. A lot was accomplished, maybe more than some people might have expected. To take us through what they accomplished, we welcome now Rose Gottemoeller. She's lecturer at Stanford University and former Deputy Secretary General of NATO. So, Rose, thank you so much for being back with us. I think there might have been low expectations, but in fact, there was something historic done, right?
Absolutely. Usually NATO summits are pretty boring affairs, or they can be. They were not when I was DSG and President Trump would come, but it has had the tradition of being more or less pre-prepared, everything agreed in advance and no surprises. I think there was a lot of preparation to this summit, but the really important steps that NATO took in terms of deciding first and foremost that Russia is a real threat that the NATO alliance will have to defend against, and putting in place this new rapid response force, 300,000 troops that NATO will be training and preparing to fight with particular NATO allies who will be perhaps under attack from a newly aggressive Russia. So this is really a big decision and an important decision, I would say.
You make a really important contrast with when President Trump went over and had some real doubts about NATO itself, at least some people were concerned about. One of the issues he had was the extent to which they were contributing, various members were contributing to the defense, the joint defense. And I think there's a 2% GDP goal. They've set out some pretty lofty goals now. How are they going to pay for them? Are they going to make it up to the 2% number?
Yes, that's one of the remarkable steps here. Again, during that period, I think that President Trump did have a positive effect, so to say, in terms of getting a lot of the NATO countries to sit up and take notice that they had made this defense investment pledge to spend 2% of GDP on defense by 2024, but not many NATO members were stepping up to that bar. Trump got them to sit up and take notice. But really, the firmest and strongest effect has been from Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So ironic that it's completely flipped so many NATO countries, principally Germany, which has the hugest economy among the NATO countries there in Europe. And the fact that it was not willing to spend 2% of GDP up until about 2030, 2032 was a big deal. Now, Putin's invasion has changed that 180%. They are getting ready to spend 2% of GDP by 2024 and raising the training and readiness of their armed forces overall. It's a huge change.
Rose, you mentioned Sweden and Finland now are going to be admitted in. How long will that take? And what happens in the meantime? For example, the commitment to joint defense, does that kick in before they're formally in?
No, they will not have the so-called Article 5 commitment applied to them in the meantime. That was a worry for both Sweden and Finland, but both governments judged that Russia is so tied down in Ukraine with its armed forces being ground up in Ukraine that they will not see a threat from Russia emerge during this period of accession. Each parliament and our Senate have to really ratify the entry of these two countries into the NATO alliance. That is a big deal and can take a long time, but all of them, including our own president, has pledged to work with our Senate, where there's strong bipartisan support, to get these two countries in as quickly as possible. I would estimate a good optimistic estimate is 6 months. More realistic, perhaps, is closer to a year.
Rose, I think that the thing that has brought NATO together remarkably, in large part, is Russia invading Ukraine. I wonder how that's going. And specifically, one development we've just learned about is Snake Island, that island in the Black Sea that now the Russians are withdrawing from, they say as a gesture of goodwill. What might that portend?
They have taken a tremendous pounding on Snake Island from the Ukrainian armed forces. And so they are withdrawing now. I think it is such an important point because it does clear the way for freedom of navigation in the Black Sea. There were a lot of concerns that Russia would be attacking ships carrying grain coming out of Odessa from their Snake Island positions. And so I see this as a good step in the direction of getting those ports open and getting that grain flowing. I know there's been a lot of work by UN Secretary General Guterres, together with President Erdogan of Turkey. Turkey, of course, implements the Montreux Convention that governs the Black Sea navigation. So I get the feeling that things are starting to move now, and I hope that soon we'll be seeing that grain flowing out of Odessa.
Is there a risk there as well, though? Because as I understand it, Russia says, okay, fine, you can bring the grain out. If you take all the mines out, you take all the mining and reverse it. And the Ukrainians, I think, are nervous if you do that, it might free up Russia to use the sea to come at them.
That is why it's going to be so important. And I don't know the details of the UN deal, but it's going to be so important to have a lot of countries, and not NATO countries. I don't think that should be a NATO operation, but have a lot of countries involved in escorting those ships through the Black Sea so that Russia can't rush back in and try to attack Odessa port, that there will be a number of countries engaged and involved in that navigation effort. Countries, I think it would be appropriate, countries who are really going to be buying the grain and have navies and perhaps could contribute a ship or two to the escort operation. So we'll see what the deal turns out to be. But like I said, I'm seeing some positive signs here.
At the same time, I'm not sure we're seeing as many positive signs on the ground in the Donbas region. It looks like Russia is sort of grinding down slowly Ukraine. What is the status there? Is there anything more NATO can or should do?
You know, Russia's got a 1,000-kilometer front in Ukraine that they're trying to fight and hold the positions they already have. And it's been a grinding effort. Everybody's been using that word. But what that means is they're pouring huge numbers of resources, men and material. They are losing a lot of people, and they are losing a lot of their weapon systems. So it's also extracting a toll on the Russian armed forces in a serious way. I frankly think we're going to see a period now, again, of regroupment where the Russians are going to be bound and determined to hold that southeastern quadrant where they have some of the bases available, and the ports in Mariupol and Kherson. They want to hold that and actually try to cut Ukraine off from the Azov Sea. So I think they're going to redouble their efforts in that area, but the Donbass they're not going to leave behind at the moment. I hope the heavy weaponry that the Ukrainians are getting now will help them to defend those lines and push them back. Everybody's got their fingers crossed on that one.
Okay, Rose, it's always really beneficial to have you with us. We really appreciate it. That's Rose Gottemoeller. She's lecturer at Stanford University and former Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Coming up, it's the end of a brutal first half of the year in the markets. We take a look at just how bad it was. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Today marks the end of the Supreme Court term. It also marks the end of the first half of 2022, a time that particularly some equity investors might not be sad to see go. To give us an update on where we are at this point, just on the cusp of the end of that first half, we welcome now Kriti Gupta. So, Kriti, give us a sense of how bad it's been.
Yeah, well, pretty bad. Remember, today is not just the end of the first half, it's the end of the month, it's the end of the quarter as well. So there's a lot of rebalancing that you're going to see. An intraday chart of the S&P 500 really frames that nicely, and where it's just choppy action. People are getting in, they're getting out, they're trying to basically prepare themselves for the back half of the year, but also the long weekend that's coming up. Year to date, though, the S&P 500, once again, in a bear market, down 20% from its peak. You got the bond index down about 14.3% as well. Globally, it's not just U.S. Treasuries. And of course, that dollar strength, it does continue, but that yen weakness is also still a major part of that conversation. And in the meantime, the energy story is up 60% in just these last 6 months, David. So it's been a pretty volatile trade. The question I think right now is, does this reverse in the third quarter, specifically simply because this is Is this a buy the dip opportunity, or is this really where it continues?
You mentioned the Japanese yen, but talk about the dollar as well, because the dollar has just been on a tear, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down, does it?
It doesn't seem to be slowing down, but I think the drivers of it are a little bit different in that the dollar has been growing a lot because of those interest rate differentials. A very hawkish Federal Reserve against a less hawkish ECB and certainly less hawkish BOJ as well. Then you have the function of, well, if the rest of these central banks are catching up, we heard about the Swiss National Bank, their first 50 basis point hike in ages. If you have them all catching up, then what's the bull case for the dollar? And the story is recession. Where else do you go if the entire world falls into a recession? And right now, the dollar still plays that haven role.
What's the bond market telling us at the moment? Because I noticed last time I checked, at least, the yield was down somewhat on the 10-year.
Well, the yield is down today. It's down about 11 basis points. So you are seeing a significant move lower. But once again, it's those rebalancing flows, because remember, you have seen yields just go higher and higher, pushing the dollar higher and higher as we were speaking. So a reversal of that. But honestly, I think the move that you have to keep in mind here is what's going on in the stock market. David, if I can share with you a little piece of nerdiness, and it's going to be this kind of parallel that you saw going all the way back to 1962. This has been the worst start of the year.
1962, yeah.
To 1962.
You were not around then, I was.
I wasn't around. I'm sure you can shed plenty of light on it. But what's important about that year is that there was this thing called the Kennedy slide, 9 straight months of declines that had followed these massive gains. And it's a kind of similar situation now. The head of the American Stock Exchange at the time said, there's no real reason. The markets are functioning just fine. But it's really just kind of a re-rating, a revaluing. And the pivot point for that, David, was the Cuban Missile Crisis, the end of that. So we also have to keep in mind, it's not just recession talks, not just the Federal Reserve. It's also the war in Ukraine that may just be weighing on markets, even as they have priced in some of those commodity shocks.
By the way, I actually remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was
you?
only 9 years old, but I remember it. Yeah, it was a pretty searing memory. What about the consumer? Because we got some eco data this morning.
We did.
Maybe raise some questions.
And perhaps turning around the tape just a little bit, because we got that PCE deflator number, which is very important for people like at the Federal Reserve. They love to watch that metric, and we're expecting these massive increases in inflation, which we did get, but the margin of the move wasn't as significant as the estimates were. So you did see a little bit of perhaps good news kind of wrapped in some not so good news there, but it is important to keep in mind that perhaps some of those price pressures are easing. If you look at food prices or even shipping rates, that's all part of it.
Kirti, thank you so much for that summary of a pretty difficult first half, I think it's fair to say. You can catch Kirti Gupta again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Markets. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and also online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to John Authors about why the markets may be misleading us about inflation. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio.